Here in the center of Warren County, under this oak and in the shadow of the courthouse, a man watched his younger brother die. In 1882, Elijah Kilgore was hanged right here after a swift and bitter trial.
Between August 15th and October 3rd, 1899, 20 county deputies died during systematic campaign by Lewis Kilgore, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for publicly hanging his brother James in Courthouse Square after trial that had convicted James of murdering prominent businessmen based entirely on testimony from single witness, whose account had contradicted physical evidence and whose financial relationship with victim's family had created obvious motive for perjury, execution that had proceeded despite appeals presenting evidence proving James's innocence, including alibi witnesses and medical testimony demonstrating that murder couldn't have occurred as prosecution had described. Hanging that spectators estimated had drawn 5,000 people to witness public execution that Tennessee law still authorized during era when such spectacles were common throughout South, where crowds gathered to watch condemned prisoners die on gallows erected in town squares. By October 7th, all 20 deputies who'd participated in constructing gallows, or who'd served as guards during execution, or who'd assisted with hanging itself, were dead, their bodies discovered throughout Giles County, Tennessee, where 38-year-old Lewis Kilgore had systematically hunted and killed law enforcement officers, through methods demonstrating that when legal systems execute innocent men based on perjured testimony, and when appeals revealing exculpatory evidence are denied, then family members will deliver retribution that courts declined to provide, even when overwhelming proof of innocence had been presented but had been rejected through procedural barriers preventing consideration of new evidence after convictions became final. Giles County, Tennessee, occupied 611 square miles of agricultural land in southern middle portion of state in 1899, populated by approximately 32,000 people, mostly farming cotton or tobacco, or working in small manufacturing operations that regional economy supported. Conservative community, where courthouse in county seat of Pulaski dominated town square, and where public executions attracted crowds from surrounding counties when condemned prisoners were hanged on gallows that carpenters constructed specifically for each execution before dismantling structures after bodies had been removed. The region had been birthplace of Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction era 3 decades earlier. Legacy that continued influencing racial attitudes, and that created atmosphere where violence was often tolerated or celebrated when directed against populations that white majority viewed as threatening social order, that Jim Crow laws and extra-legal intimidation maintained through systematic oppression. August 1899 meant sweltering heat in Tennessee valleys, where temperature and humidity created oppressive conditions that made outdoor labor nearly unbearable and that made public gatherings uncomfortable, except when morbid fascination with executions overcame discomfort that weather imposed. Month also marked period when cotton harvest was approaching, creating anxiety among farmers whose livelihoods depended on crop yields and on prices that markets would pay for production that represented years' agricultural labor. The specific date of James Kilgore's execution, August 14th, had been scheduled to occur on Saturday, when farmers could attend without missing weekday work. Timing that reflected officials' understanding that public executions served entertainment function beyond legal purpose of carrying out sentences that courts had imposed for capital crimes. Lewis Kilgore was 38 years old in August 1899, had worked alongside younger brother James on family farm that their father had established in 1850s, before dying in 1887, leaving brothers to continue operating property that included 200 acres of productive bottomland along creek and extensive wooded hillsides providing timber and hunting. Farm that Lewis and James had maintained successfully through partnership, where Lewis handled business management, while James performed most physical labor that his younger age and stronger constitution made him better suited for than older brother, whose health had been compromised by childhood illness, leaving him less capable of sustained manual work. Brothers had been extremely close, had never married, focusing instead on farm operations and on maintaining property that represented family legacy, and that provided adequate if modest income supporting their bachelor lifestyle. James Kilgore's arrest had occurred in March 1899, when prominent businessman William Harrison had been found dead at his warehouse, shot twice in chest from close range, suggesting confrontation rather than ambush or random violence. Killing had occurred during evening when warehouse district had been largely deserted, meaning that witnesses were scarce and that identifying murderer would depend primarily on physical evidence or on testimony from anyone who might have observed events. Harrison had been a wealthy merchant whose cotton brokerage business had made him one of Pulaski's most prosperous citizens. His death had created sensation throughout county, where residents had speculated about motives and about who might have wanted prominent businessman dead. Investigation had focused quickly on James Kilgore after Marcus Webb. Warehouse night watchman who claimed to have witnessed shooting from distance had provided testimony identifying James as person he'd seen fleeing scene shortly after gunshots had been heard. Webb's testimony had been questionable from beginning. His vantage point had been approximately 200 yards from warehouse where murder occurred, and darkness had been complete when shooting happened, meaning that identifying specific individual from that distance in those conditions seemed nearly impossible. But Webb had insisted that he'd recognized James, whom he claimed to have known from previous encounters. That distinctive gait that James had exhibited due to childhood injury affecting his leg had made identification certain, despite distance and darkness. James had been arrested despite having alibi placing him at farm during time when murder had occurred. Lewis and 3 farmhands had testified that James had been working with them, repairing barn roof until after dark on evening when Harrison was killed. That group had eaten dinner together, and that James had remained at farm throughout evening, never leaving property. But prosecutor David Mitchell had dismissed alibi testimony as family and employees protecting James had argued that witnesses had no independent verification of times and that conspiracy to provide false alibi was obvious when family members and subordinate employees all corroborated defendants' claims about whereabouts during crime. Trial had occurred in May 1899. Prosecution's case had relied almost entirely on Webb's eyewitness testimony identifying James as person fleeing murder scene, supplemented by character assassination, attempting to establish that James had motive for killing Harrison, because cotton prices that Harrison's brokerage paid to farmers had been lower than prices that competing brokers offered, meaning that farmers, including Kilgore brothers, had reason to resent businessmen whose pricing policies had cost them income. Defense had presented alibi witnesses and had challenged Webb's ability to identify anyone from distance and in darkness, had introduced expert testimony from physician explaining that human vision couldn't reliably distinguish specific individuals under conditions Webb described, had presented evidence showing that James's supposed motive was shared by hundreds of farmers throughout county, who'd sold cotton to Harrison at disadvantageous prices, meaning that if dissatisfaction with businessmen constituted motive, then virtually entire agricultural community would be suspects. But jury of 12 white men from Pulaski had convicted James after deliberating only 3 hours. Verdict had reflected deference to Webb's testimony, despite obvious problems with identification, and had reflected prosecution's success in portraying James as disgruntled farmer whose resentment had escalated to murder when Harrison's business practices had continued costing local producers income. Judge had sentenced James to death by hanging, mandatory punishment under Tennessee law for first-degree murder convictions. Execution had been scheduled for August 14th, giving defense approximately 3 months for filing appeals, attempting to overturn conviction or to obtain new trial based on evidence that trial had excluded, or on arguments about inadequate legal representation that capital cases required. Appeals had been filed with Tennessee Supreme Court, presenting multiple grounds for reversal, including insufficiency of evidence when single questionable eyewitness testimony couldn't support conviction beyond reasonable doubt, improper exclusion of defense evidence about physical impossibility of Webb's identification, inadequate jury instructions about burden of proof, prosecutorial misconduct during closing arguments that had inflamed jurors against defendant through appealing to prejudices rather than through arguing evidence. But Tennessee Supreme Court had denied appeal in July 1899, ruling that trial court's decisions had been within acceptable discretion and that jury's guilty verdict had to be respected when evidence, however questionable, had been sufficient for reasonable jurors to convict. Most devastating development had occurred in late July, when defense investigators had discovered evidence proving James's innocence conclusively, evidence that would have prevented conviction if it had been available during trial. Investigation had revealed that Marcus Webb, the eyewitness who'd identified James, had been William Harrison's nephew and had been beneficiary receiving substantial inheritance following Uncle's death. Relationship and financial interest that Webb had concealed during trial when defense had asked whether he had any connection to victim that might bias testimony or create motive for false accusation. Webb had lied under oath, claiming he'd been merely night watchman, with no personal relationship to Harrison. Perjury had been a deliberate attempt to conceal conflict of interest that would have destroyed credibility if jury had known that witness stood to inherit approximately $50,000 from Uncle's estate following conviction of someone, anyone, for murder that would allow estate to be settled. Additionally, investigation had discovered that actual murderer had been Robert Harrison, William Harrison's brother, who'd killed him during dispute over business partnership, and who'd been in financial position to benefit from brother's death through inheriting controlling interest in cotton brokerage that brothers had operated together. Physical evidence that investigation uncovered, including blood-stained clothing that Robert had hidden, and witness testimony from people who'd overheard brothers arguing violently on day of murder, all pointed to Robert as actual killer rather than James, who'd had no connection to Harrison beyond routine business transactions selling cotton. But discovery had come too late. Motions for new trial based on newly discovered evidence had been filed with trial court in early August. But Judge Thomas Bradford had denied motions ruling that evidence should have been discovered before trial through adequate investigation, and that allowing new trials based on post-conviction discoveries would create endless delays in carrying out sentences that justice required be executed. Promptly after convictions became final, Tennessee Supreme Court had similarly denied emergency motions to stay execution pending consideration of new evidence. Court had ruled that procedural rules governing post-conviction relief required that newly discovered evidence be genuinely impossible to discover before trial through reasonable diligence. That defense investigators' failure to uncover Webb's relationship to victim or to identify Robert Harrison as alternative suspect during months between arrest and trial demonstrated inadequate investigation rather than true impossibility justifying post-conviction consideration. Court's August 12th ruling had meant that execution scheduled for August 14th would proceed, despite overwhelming evidence that James was innocent and that actual murderer remained free, while innocent man would be hanged based on perjured testimony from witness whose financial interest in conviction had been deliberately concealed. Lewis had attended brother's execution, along with approximately 5,000 spectators who'd gathered in Pulaski Courthouse Square to witness hanging. Crowd that had filled square and surrounding streets, creating carnival atmosphere that public executions typically generated during era when such events were community gatherings, providing entertainment and reinforcing social order through demonstrating state's power to punish those convicted of serious crimes. Gallows had been constructed in center of square. Wooden platform elevated approximately 8 feet above ground with 13 steps leading to top, where noose hung from crossbeam, structure that 20 deputies had built during previous days under supervision of Sheriff William Mitchell, who'd overseen construction ensuring that apparatus would function properly during execution. James had been led from jail to gallows at precisely 10:00 a.m. on August 14th, hands bound behind back and surrounded by 20 deputies who'd been assigned to escort condemned prisoner and to prevent any rescue attempt or disruption that sympathizers might attempt during procession from jail to execution site, approximately 200 yards distant. Crowd had watched silently as procession moved slowly toward gallows, spectators pressing close to see condemned man's face and demeanor. As he'd approached death, James had walked steadily, showing no obvious fear or distress, maintaining composure that witnesses later described as remarkable given circumstances. Upon reaching gallows platform, James had been given opportunity to make final statement that tradition allowed condemned prisoners, He'd spoken for approximately 5 minutes, declaring his innocence, explaining that Marcus Webb had lied about witnessing murder, that he'd been at farm with brother and workers when Harrison was killed, that real murderer was Robert Harrison, who'd killed brother and had allowed innocent man to be convicted and executed for crime, that Tennessee justice system had failed by refusing to consider new evidence proving innocence, and by allowing execution to proceed when obvious reasonable doubt existed about guilt. James had concluded by asking Lewis to continue fighting for truth and to ensure that his innocence would eventually be acknowledged, even though acknowledgement would come too late to save his life. Words that Lewis had heard from position at front of crowd, where he'd been standing watching brother's final moments. Sheriff Mitchell had then placed black hood over James's head and had adjusted noose around neck, had stepped back, and had signaled to deputy controlling trapdoor mechanism. Door had dropped, and James's body had fallen through opening, jerking to sudden stop, when rope had caught creating snap. That crowd had heard clearly. James had died within minutes. Body had been left hanging for approximately 15 minutes, as custom dictated, before deputies had removed corpse and had transported it to undertaker for preparation and burial. Crowd had dispersed slowly, many spectators lingering to discuss execution and to debate whether justice had been served. When condemned man had maintained innocence so forcefully in final statement that tradition had allowed. Lewis had remained in square long after crowds had departed, had stood staring at empty gallows that deputies were beginning to dismantle, had felt rage building as he'd contemplated that 20 men had participated in executing innocent brother based on perjured testimony that corrupt witness had provided for financial gain. That legal system had refused to consider evidence proving innocence because procedural rules valued finality over truth. That James's death had been preventable, but that institutional failures had combined to ensure that innocent man died while actual murderer remained free, and while corrupt witness collected inheritance that perjury had enabled him to obtain through framing innocent person for murder. Lewis's decision to systematically eliminate 20 deputies who'd participated in James's execution was made during days following hanging, when he'd realized that legal system that had refused to consider evidence proving brother's innocence would similarly refuse to prosecute Robert Harrison for actual murder or to charge Marcus Webb with perjury when doing so would require acknowledging that innocent man had been executed based on fraudulent testimony, that allowing participants in judicial murder to continue serving without consequences would mean accepting that some executions of innocent people were acceptable errors, that system's commitment to finality justified despite truth. Lewis understood that systematic campaign would result in his death or imprisonment, but believed that avenging James and exposing system's failure justified sacrificing freedom when alternative was accepting that brother's execution would stand as just result of fair process rather than being recognized as judicial murder that corruption and institutional rigidity had produced. The systematic elimination began August 15th, day after execution, when Deputy Thomas Harrison was found dead at his home, shot once through head from hunting rifle, fired through window while Harrison had been sleeping. Killing demonstrated deliberate planning and cold precision, suggesting that perpetrator had targeted specific individual, rather than engaging in random violence. Investigation revealed that Harrison had been one of deputies who'd built gallows. His involvement in construction had made him first target of campaign that would eventually kill all 20 participants. Deputy William Bradford died August 18th under similar circumstances, shot twice while working in barn on his property. Execution-style killing that investigators recognized wasn't random crime, but was targeted assassination of specific deputy who'd participated in James Kilgore's hanging. Bradford had been among escorts who'd guarded James during procession from jail to gallows. His death demonstrated that perpetrator was systematically targeting all participants rather than limiting vengeance to those who'd performed actual hanging. Pattern became unmistakable when additional deputies died throughout August and September, with killings occurring through shootings at their homes or properties, through explosions destroying vehicles when deputies started engines, through poisoning administered in food or drink at locations where officers regularly ate, diverse methods creating uncertainty about how attacks would occur and making protection difficult when perpetrators seemed capable of striking, regardless of security measures that increasingly frightened survivors were implementing. Deaths demonstrated sophisticated planning, suggesting intelligence gathering about targets' routines and vulnerabilities, knowledge about various killing methods including explosives and poisons that Lewis had apparently researched through reading technical manuals or through obtaining information from sources that investigation never identified. Sheriff Mitchell himself died September 10th when bomb exploded under vehicle. As he'd prepared to drive to work, blast had been powerful enough to destroy automobile completely and to kill Mitchell instantly. Explosion had occurred at his home, despite guards who'd been posted to protect Sheriff, whose position as overseer of execution made him obvious target. Mitchell's death had been particularly significant because he'd supervised gallows construction and had given signal for trapdoor to drop. His elimination represented specific targeting of those most directly responsible for execution rather than random violence against any available deputies. By October 3rd, 20 deputies were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded with military efficiency, despite massive manhunt involving Tennessee State Militia searching throughout Giles County for perpetrator, who remained elusive despite hundreds of soldiers deployed to locate and capture killer. Elimination of all execution participants within 7 weeks demonstrated capability and determination that authorities hadn't anticipated from Farmer, whose professional experience had been agricultural rather than military or criminal. Lewis's intimate knowledge of Giles County's geography had given him advantages that militia from other regions couldn't match, could move through familiar territory avoiding patrols, could hide at farm or at other locations where soldiers wouldn't search, could strike targets and disappear before reinforcements could respond. Recognition of perpetrator's identity came from investigation, discovering that Lewis Kilgore had been purchasing ammunition and explosives during weeks following James's execution, that witnesses had observed him near several victims' properties shortly before killings occurred, that his motive for targeting deputies who'd participated in Brother's hanging was obvious when James had maintained innocence and when Lewis had been present at execution watching Brother die. But recognition hadn't led to capture. Militia searches of farm had found no evidence, and Lewis had remained concealed somewhere in county, continuing systematic campaign until final deputy had been eliminated. Lewis remained at large for 2 additional weeks after 20th killing, before surrendering voluntarily on October 17th, walked into Tennessee State Militia headquarters in Pulaski, carrying written confession, explaining that he'd killed 20 deputies who'd participated in executing innocent Brother based on perjured testimony. That systematic elimination had been necessary response to judicial murder. That legal system refused to acknowledge despite overwhelming evidence proving James's innocence. That he'd completed mission of avenging Brother and exposing corruption that Marcus Webb's false testimony had represented. Lewis had included in confession detailed explanation of evidence proving James's innocence, including Webb's concealed relationship to victim and inheritance that perjury had enabled, Robert Harrison's guilt, proven through physical evidence that investigation should have discovered, procedural barriers that had prevented consideration of exculpatory evidence that would have prevented execution if courts had valued truth over finality. Trial for 20 murders occurred in January 1900 at Nashville Courthouse. That case had been transferred to when officials recognized that impartial jury couldn't be selected in Giles County, where public opinion about Lewis's systematic campaign was deeply divided between those who viewed killings as justified response to judicial murder and those who condemned violence against law enforcement. Regardless of Brother's innocence or system failures, prosecution presented overwhelming evidence including written confession, ballistic matches linking weapons recovered from Lewis to bullets removed from victims, explosives materials found at farm, systematic pattern proving premeditation and demonstrating that each killing had been deliberate assassination rather than spontaneous violence or self-defense. Defense didn't dispute that Lewis had killed 20 deputies, but argued that systematic campaign had been responding to judicial murder of innocent Brother that legal system had refused to acknowledge, presented evidence proving James's innocence, including Webb's concealed relationship and inheritance, Robert Harrison's guilt documented through physical evidence and witness testimony, procedural barriers that had prevented courts from considering exculpatory evidence. Defense also presented testimony from legal scholars explaining that Tennessee's procedural rules governing post-conviction relief were excessively rigid, that valuing finality over truth created situations where innocent people were executed when evidence proving innocence emerged after trials concluded. The James Kilgore's case exemplified systematic problem affecting potentially dozens or hundreds of cases throughout Tennessee, where rigid adherence to procedural deadlines prevented consideration of evidence that would have changed outcomes if courts had prioritized accuracy over efficiency. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony of investigator who discovered Webb's perjury and Robert Harrison's guilt. Investigator explained how he'd uncovered probate records showing Webb as beneficiary receiving $50,000 from Uncle's estate, how he'd found blood-stained clothing that Robert had hidden, and witness testimony from people who'd overheard Harrison brothers arguing about business partnership on day of murder, how physical evidence at murder scene had been consistent with Robert's involvement, but inconsistent with prosecution's theory about how James had supposedly committed crime. Investigator testified that all evidence proving James's innocence and Robert's guilt had been discoverable before trial through adequate investigation, but that rushed prosecution had prioritized obtaining quick conviction over conducting thorough inquiry that would have identified actual murderer and prevented innocent man's execution. But prosecution emphasized that regardless of whether James had been innocent, Lewis's systematic assassination of 20 deputies constituted murder that criminal law prohibited and that couldn't be justified through claiming that judicial murder had necessitated private violence. That proper response to brothers' wrongful execution would have been continued appeals or civil litigation or public advocacy, rather than employing systematic killing that had no sanction under law. Prosecutors also noted that Lewis's victims had included deputies whose participation in execution had been peripheral, that carpenters who'd built gallows and guards who'd escorted prisoner hadn't been responsible for false testimony or for procedural barriers preventing consideration of exculpatory evidence, argued that killing people whose degrees of culpability varied significantly represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that James's execution had been judicial murder deserving accountability. Jury deliberated 11 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 20 murder counts. Longest jury deliberation in Tennessee history at that time reflected internal debates about whether Lewis's circumstances created mitigation, even though law clearly prohibited systematic killing, regardless of provocations or institutional failures. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply sympathetic to Lewis's position and had been outraged by judicial murder of innocent brother, but that overwhelming evidence of premeditated killings made conviction mandatory, even when moral complexity made simple guilty verdicts seem inadequate for capturing reality. That system failures had created situation where desperate brother had employed violence that society condemned. Judge sentenced Lewis to death by hanging, ironic punishment mirroring method through which brother had been executed. Sentence was mandatory under Tennessee law for multiple first-degree murder convictions, even though circumstances were extraordinary, and even though many observers believed that deputies who'd participated in executing innocent man bore responsibility that legal system couldn't adequately assign when institutional structures protected individuals performing official duties from accountability for outcomes that procedures produced, regardless of whether those outcomes were just. Judge explained that only governor could commute sentence through clemency, recognizing extraordinary circumstances that trial had documented, but that court's role was limited to imposing sentence that law required for convictions that jury had rendered. Lewis's execution was scheduled for June 1900, but attracted national attention from legal reform advocates highlighting how rigid procedural rules had prevented courts from considering evidence proving James Kilgore's innocence. Petitions seeking clemency gathered over 100,000 signatures, arguing that executing man who'd been responding to judicial murder represented compounding tragedy rather than delivering appropriate justice. that Tennessee's failure to acknowledge brother's innocence or to prosecute perjured witness or actual murderer demonstrated systematic problems deserving reform rather than executions adding additional victims to those that system had already produced. Tennessee Governor Benton McMillan reviewed clemency petition in May 1900, commuted sentence to life imprisonment, citing extraordinary circumstances, while maintaining that systematic murder of 20 deputies couldn't be excused regardless of brother's innocence or system failure's motivating campaign. Lewis served 41 years at Tennessee State Penitentiary before dying in 1941 at age 80, from complications of pneumonia that inadequate prison medical care had allowed to progress untreated, buried in family cemetery where brother James had been interred following execution 39 years earlier. Lewis's funeral attracted approximately 300 people, including descendants of some execution victims who'd come to acknowledge that their ancestors had participated in judicial murder and who viewed Lewis's systematic campaign as understandable, if not justifiable, response to institutional failures that had killed innocent man while refusing to acknowledge error. During 41 years of imprisonment, Lewis became symbol for movements advocating criminal justice reforms, including establishing robust post-conviction review procedures, allowing consideration of newly discovered evidence proving innocence. His case was cited extensively by wrongful conviction organizations emerging during early 20th century, highlighting how procedural barriers prevented courts from correcting errors even when evidence definitively proved that innocent people had been convicted and executed. His story also resonated with broader movements challenging capital punishment, through arguing that irreversible nature of death penalty made executing innocent people inevitable when fallible human institutions administered criminal justice systems whose errors couldn't be corrected after executions occurred. James Kilgore's innocence had never been officially acknowledged during Lewis's lifetime, despite evidence that defense had presented during trial, demonstrating that execution had been judicial murder based on perjured testimony from witness with financial interest in conviction, and that actual murderer had remained free while innocent man had been hanged. Marcus Webb had continued living in Giles County until dying of natural causes in 1935. Had never been charged with perjury, despite overwhelming evidence that his trial testimony identifying James as fleeing murder scene had been deliberately false, and that concealing relationship to victim had been intentional fraud designed to prevent jury from recognizing bias that would have destroyed credibility. Robert Harrison had similarly avoided prosecution for murdering brother William, despite physical evidence and witness testimony that investigation had uncovered proving guilt. Officials had declined pursuing charges, explaining that proceeding against Robert would require acknowledging that James had been innocent, and that state had executed wrong man. Acknowledgement that Tennessee authorities had been unwilling to make when doing so would expose system failures and would create legal liability for wrongful death that Lewis Kilgore's family could pursue through civil litigation if innocence were officially recognized. The mid-20th century brought renewed attention to Lewis Kilgore case, when legal historian Patricia Morrison obtained trial records and investigative files through Tennessee Archives research. Documents revealed extensive evidence proving James's innocence that had been presented during Lewis's trial, but that Tennessee had refused to acknowledge officially despite overwhelming proof that judicial murder had occurred. Morrison published findings in 1975 book titled Tennessee Reaper: How Judicial Murder Created Appalachian Avenger, comprehensive examination documenting James's trial based on perjured testimony, appeals that had been denied despite new evidence, public execution witnessed by 5,000 spectators, Lewis's systematic elimination of 20 deputies, trial presenting proof of James's innocence, imprisonment and death without official acknowledgement that brother's execution had been wrong. Most shocking discovery was documentation, proving that Judge Bradford, who'd presided over James's trial and who'd denied motions for new trial, had been aware before execution that Marcus Webb's testimony was questionable. Internal correspondence showed that Bradford had received an anonymous letter shortly before execution, detailing Webb's relationship to victim and financial interest in conviction. That letter had urged Bradford to stay execution, pending investigation of perjury allegations, but that judge had dismissed letter as attempt by defense supporters to create delay and had proceeded with execution without investigating whether Webb had committed perjury that would have invalidated conviction. Documents proved that judicial murder could have been prevented if Bradford had taken seriously allegations about prosecution's star witness, rather than assuming that procedural regularity was sufficient, regardless of whether conviction had been based on fraudulent testimony. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2010, film titled Hangman's Justice. Lewis Kilgore's War Against Judicial Murder, featuring interviews with historians, wrongful conviction scholars, Morrison discussing research findings, descendants of Lewis and James expressing perspectives on whether systematic elimination of 20 deputies had been justified response to executing innocent man based on perjured testimony, or whether violence had exceeded what circumstances warranted even acknowledging that legal system had failed catastrophically. Most powerful segment featured interview with Michael Kilgore, age 63 in 2010, and great-great-grandson of Lewis, describing how learning about family history had motivated his advocacy for wrongful conviction reforms and for establishing robust post-conviction review procedures, allowing courts to consider newly discovered evidence proving innocence. Michael explained that discovering that great-great-grandfather James had been hanged based on perjured testimony from witness with financial interest in conviction, that courts had refused to consider evidence proving innocence because procedural rules valued finality over truth, and that great-great-grandfather Lewis had systematically killed 20 deputies after legal system refused to acknowledge judicial murder, helped me understand that procedural barriers preventing consideration of exculpatory evidence aren't just historical problems, but continue affecting people today, when rigid adherence to deadlines prevents courts from correcting errors, even when overwhelming proof of innocence emerges after convictions become final. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered personnel records, showing that at least 6 of 20 deputies Lewis had killed had privately expressed concerns about executing James to supervisors who'd dismissed objections and had ordered participation threatening termination if deputies refused to perform assigned duties. Records proved that some victims had been reluctant participants in execution rather than enthusiastic enforcers, and that Lewis's systematic campaign hadn't discriminated between primary organizers like Sheriff Mitchell, who'd supervised entire process, and coerced followers whose participation had been motivated by fear of professional retaliation rather than by personal commitment to carrying out execution that evidence suggested was judicial murder. Discovery of personnel files documenting deputies' private objections generated debates among Lewis's defenders about whether systematic elimination of all 20 had been justified when some victims had borne limited personal responsibility for execution that command structure and institutional procedures had required, despite individual misgivings. Whether distinguishing between willing participants and coerced followers should have affected targeting decisions. Whether killing people whose culpability varied significantly represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that James's execution had been judicial murder, deserving accountability that system had refused to provide. Tennessee conducted review in 2011, examining whether posthumous exoneration of James Kilgore was warranted, given documentary evidence proving that conviction had been based on perjured testimony and that actual murderer had been identified through investigation that trial had failed to conduct adequately. Review concluded that, while evidence of James Kilgore's innocence is overwhelming and clearly demonstrates that execution was judicial murder based on fraudulent testimony, Tennessee statutes don't provide mechanisms for posthumous exoneration in cases where defendants died before appellate processes were exhausted. That acknowledging innocence 112 years after execution would create precedent, requiring review of potentially thousands of historical cases where similar questions might exist about conviction validity. Review's conclusion frustrated wrongful conviction advocates who'd hoped definitive acknowledgement would provide closure for Lewis Kilgore's descendants and would establish that systematic campaign had been responding to real injustice rather than representing unprovoked violence against law enforcement. But Tennessee established Memorial and Educational Center in 2012 at Pulaski Courthouse Square, where James had been executed. Memorial documented case through multiple perspectives, including James's trial, emphasizing perjured testimony and concealed conflicts of interest. Appeals presenting evidence of innocence that procedural barriers had prevented courts from considering. Public execution attended by 5,000 spectators. Lewis's systematic elimination campaign. Trial proving James's innocence. Imprisonment without official acknowledgement. Newly discovered documents showing deputies' objections. Debates about justified retaliation versus excessive violence. Central exhibit featured timeline showing how evidence proving James's innocence had emerged during weeks before execution, but had been rejected by courts applying procedural rules preventing consideration of newly discovered evidence. Visitors could read Webb's perjured trial testimony, could view probate records showing $50,000 inheritance creating motive for false identification, could examine physical evidence proving Robert Harrison's guilt, could see correspondence showing Judge Bradford had received warning about perjury before execution but had dismissed concerns, could view Tennessee Supreme Court ruling denying stay based on procedural grounds rather than evaluating evidence merits. Exhibit's emphasis was on demonstrating how institutional rigidity had prevented truth from affecting outcome, even when overwhelming proof of innocence had been available if courts had valued accuracy over finality. Memorial Room honored both James Kilgore, who'd been executed despite innocence, and 20 deputies who'd been killed during systematic campaign. Memorial acknowledged that victims included both innocent men judicially murdered and law enforcement officers killed while performing official duties that institutional procedures had required, even when some had privately objected to participating in execution that evidence suggested was wrong. Memorial included audio recording from Michael Kilgore, describing how discovering family history had motivated his wrongful conviction advocacy work, attempting to prevent future judicial murders through establishing procedures allowing consideration of exculpatory evidence regardless of procedural deadlines, that historical cases had demonstrated could prevent truth from affecting outcomes. Museum's final exhibit examined broader question that Lewis's case raised about appropriate responses when legal systems execute innocent people and when institutional rigidity prevents correcting errors despite overwhelming evidence proving mistakes. Memorial Wall posed question, what should families do when loved ones are executed based on perjured testimony and when courts refuse to consider evidence proving innocence because procedural rules value finality over truth, alongside competing responses emphasizing continued legal advocacy despite system failures versus desperate violence when institutions demonstrate unwillingness to acknowledge errors that result in irreversible deaths. By 2024, Lewis Kilgore's case remained most studied example in courses examining wrongful convictions and examining procedural barriers preventing post-conviction relief. Case studied in law school seminars about tension between finality and accuracy in criminal justice. Discussed in capital punishment debates as historical precedent, demonstrating inevitability of executing innocent people when procedural rules prevent consideration of exculpatory evidence. Modern wrongful conviction advocates invoke Lewis as symbol of how rigid adherence to procedural deadlines can result in irreversible tragedies when truth emerges too late to affect outcomes, argue that his systematic violence, while inexcusable, was comprehensible response to judicial murder. That system refused to acknowledge despite overwhelming proof. Congressional hearings in 2013 examining wrongful conviction reforms cited Lewis Kilgore case when questioning whether adequate post-conviction review procedures existed for allowing courts to consider newly discovered evidence proving innocence. Testimony from Innocence Project attorneys and from exonerated defendants suggested that procedural barriers similar to those that had prevented James's case from being reconsidered continued affecting cases throughout United States where newly discovered evidence emerged after conviction deadlines had passed. That rigid adherence to procedural finality was resulting in innocent people remaining imprisoned or being executed when courts prioritized efficiency over accuracy. Hearings resulted in recommendations for establishing national standards requiring states to provide meaningful post-conviction review when substantial evidence proving innocence emerges regardless of procedural deadlines. 4. Creating federal habeas corpus procedures specifically designed for actual innocence claims, rather than requiring defendants to demonstrate constitutional violations that procedural default doctrines might preclude courts from considering. For implementing compensation systems, providing meaningful relief to wrongfully convicted individuals and their families when states' errors result in years or decades of wrongful imprisonment or in executions of innocent people. Federal legislation passed in 2014 established James Kilgore Wrongful Conviction Review Act, requiring federal courts to consider actual innocence claims based on newly discovered evidence, even when state procedural barriers had prevented consideration, creating pathway for federal review when substantial evidence proving innocence emerged after state remedies had been exhausted or had been procedurally barred. Legislation was named for Lewis's brother, whose execution, despite overwhelming evidence of innocence, had exemplified problems that rigid procedural rules created when preventing truth from affecting outcomes. Under new statute, federal courts began reviewing approximately 200 cases from states throughout nation where defendants claimed that newly discovered evidence proved innocence, but where state courts had declined consideration based on procedural barriers. Reviews resulted in 37 exonerations, including cases where defendants had served decades in prison or had been executed before evidence proving innocence had emerged and had been presented through federal review procedures that James Kilgore Act had established. Tennessee conducted separate review in 2015 under state legislation that had been passed following federal reforms. State Review Board examined approximately 80 historical Tennessee cases where questions about conviction validity had been raised, but where procedural barriers had prevented consideration. Board recommended 12 posthumous exonerations, including James Kilgore, whose case had become symbol of wrongful conviction problem that procedural rigidity had exacerbated. Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam issued official exoneration statement in December 2015, explaining that James Kilgore was innocent of murdering William Harrison. Conviction was based on perjured testimony from witness who concealed financial interest in outcome and who falsely identified James as person fleeing murder scene when actual murderer was William Harrison's brother Robert, whose guilt was proven through physical evidence and witness testimony that adequate investigation would have discovered before trial. That Tennessee courts' refusal to consider evidence proving innocence before execution represented failure of justice, that procedural reforms are designed to prevent in future cases. Tennessee's official exoneration 116 years after James's execution was unprecedented acknowledgement of judicial murder, represented significant departure from historical pattern, where states had resisted admitting wrongful convictions even when evidence was overwhelming, and even when exonerations would provide closure to families and would establish that violence or desperation that wrongful convictions had motivated had been responding to real injustices rather than representing unprovoked criminality. But statement generated mixed reactions from descendants of 20 deputies Lewis had killed. Some welcomed acknowledgement that execution had been wrong and that Lewis's violence had been responding to judicial murder rather than simply representing hatred of law enforcement. Others maintained that exonerating James dishonored ancestors by suggesting their deaths had been justified consequences of participating in execution when actually they'd been murder victims, regardless of whether James had been innocent. Historical marker installed at Lewis's grave in 2016 reflected balanced approach, attempting to acknowledge multiple perspectives. Inscription reading: Lewis Kilgore, 1861 to 1941, systematically killed 20 county deputies who participated in publicly hanging his brother James in Courthouse Square. After trial, convicted James of murder based on perjured testimony from witness who concealed $50,000 inheritance, creating financial interest in conviction. Tennessee courts refused to consider evidence proving James's innocence because procedural rules preventing post-conviction review of newly discovered evidence. Kilgore eliminated all execution participants within 7 weeks, including 6 who'd privately objected to participating, but had been coerced through threats of termination. Served 41 years imprisonment before dying, without witnessing official acknowledgement of brother's innocence. Case prompted federal reforms, including James Kilgore Wrongful Conviction Review Act, requiring courts to consider actual innocence claims regardless of procedural barriers. Tennessee officially exonerated James in 2015, acknowledging execution was judicial murder. This grave reminds us that procedural rigidity preventing consideration of exculpatory evidence creates judicial murders, that institutional failures executing innocent people provoke desperate responses, that systematic violence affects everyone when legal systems value finality over truth and refuse acknowledging errors that result in irreversible deaths. Comparative analysis examining Lewis's 20 victims revealed complex picture where 4, including Sheriff Mitchell, had been primary organizers whose roles had been essential for execution. 10 had been participants whose functions had involved specific duties like building gallows or guarding prisoner, but who hadn't been involved in organizing overall process. 6 had been documented reluctant participants who'd privately objected to execution, but had participated following orders under threat of termination. This distribution raised questions about whether Lewis's systematic elimination should have distinguished among degrees of culpability rather than treating all participants as equally responsible. Whether killing 6 who'd objected represented excessive response even when acknowledging that their participation had enabled judicial murder regardless of private misgivings. Lewis's written confession hadn't addressed these distinctions, had characterized all 20 as execution participants without differentiating between organizers and coerced followers, suggested that he'd viewed anyone who'd contributed to James's death as equally guilty, regardless of their motivations or their degrees of agency in planning and conducting execution. Modern analysts examining confession debate whether distinction would have been practically possible during campaign, when identifying which deputies had objected would have required access to personnel files that investigation discovered only 100 years later. Whether expecting such discrimination was reasonable when desperate brother avenging judicial murder would have focused on participation in execution rather than on motivations that documents later revealed. Descendants of Lewis, including Michael Kilgore, who'd become prominent wrongful conviction advocate, expressed nuanced perspectives about great-great-grandfather's systematic violence. Michael acknowledged that campaign had exposed real problems with procedural barriers preventing consideration of exculpatory evidence, but emphasized that killing 20 people, including 6 who'd been coerced, created victims whose families deserved recognition that simplified narratives celebrating vengeance often failed to provide. Michael's balanced position created controversy within family, where some members maintained that Lewis's actions should be defended unconditionally as justified response to judicial murder, while others agreed with Michael that moral complexity required acknowledging both system failures and excessive violence that had killed people whose degrees of responsibility varied significantly. Federal legislation establishing wrongful conviction review procedures prompted examination of broader patterns where procedural barriers had historically prevented courts from considering newly discovered evidence proving innocence. Department of Justice review examined approximately 1,200 cases from 1880-1980 period, where defendants had claimed that post-conviction evidence proved innocence, but where state courts had declined consideration based on procedural grounds. Reviews identified systematic patterns where rigid adherence to deadlines and finality had prevented truth from affecting outcomes even when evidence was overwhelming. Reviews resulted in 143 official acknowledgements of wrongful convictions, including 67 cases where defendants had been executed before evidence proving innocence had emerged or had been considered. Outcomes that Lewis's advocates characterized as vindication, demonstrating that his claims about system valuing finality over truth had been accurate descriptions of widespread problems rather than exaggerations designed to justify violence. But critics argued that acknowledging historical failures a century later provided little meaningful benefit to families who'd suffered, and that emphasis on systemic context risked minimizing Lewis's criminal responsibility for systematic killing that no circumstances could justify regardless of how catastrophic judicial murder had been. Contemporary debates about appropriate memorialization of Lewis's case reflected broader conflicts about how societies should remember complex figures whose legitimate grievances motivated indefensible methods, about whether acknowledging judicial murder meant condoning systematic assassination of law enforcement officers who'd participated in execution, about how to honor innocent victim while recognizing that brothers' desperate response created additional victims. Annual memorial services held at Pulaski Courthouse Square attracted both supporters celebrating Lewis's delivery of accountability that system had refused and critics condemning systematic violence. Gatherings demonstrated persistent disagreements about limits of justified retaliation when authorities execute innocent people, and about whether desperate measures become morally permissible when institutions demonstrate unwillingness to acknowledge errors resulting in irreversible deaths. Modern wrongful conviction movements and capital punishment opponents invoke Lewis as symbol of why procedural barriers must not prevent courts from considering evidence proving innocence, argue that his case demonstrates that rigid adherence to finality creates judicial murders when truth emerges too late to affect outcomes through normal procedures, that preventing future tragedies requires robust post-conviction review, allowing consideration of newly discovered evidence regardless of deadlines. Critics counter that celebrating systematic killer of law enforcement officers risks encouraging extremism and undermines respect for legal processes, even when acknowledging that specific cases involved catastrophic failures. The enduring legacy of Lewis Kilgore's 1899 campaign continues shaping debates about wrongful convictions, about procedural barriers preventing post-conviction relief, about whether systematic assassination can ever be justified when responding to judicial murders, about how societies should memorialize events where legitimate grievances motivated excessive violence, creating complex moral situations. These questions remain unresolved 125 years after James's execution, and Lewis's systematic response persist wherever procedural rules prevent courts from considering evidence proving innocence, wherever institutional rigidity values finality over truth, wherever families must decide between accepting that legal systems won't acknowledge errors resulting in deaths and employing desperate measures that law condemns, but that judicial murders sometimes provoke. Until next time, remember that Lewis Kilgore killed 20 deputies who hanged innocent brother James based on perjured testimony from Marcus Webb, who concealed $50,000 inheritance, that Tennessee courts refused considering evidence proving innocence because procedural rules prevented post-conviction review, that 6 of 20 victims had objected but participated under coercion, that Tennessee officially exonerated James in 2015, acknowledging judicial murder. That case prompted federal reforms requiring courts to consider actual innocence claims, and that ultimately procedural barriers preventing consideration of exculpatory evidence create judicial murders affecting multiple generations when institutional rigidity values finality over truth, and when desperate responses become necessary for exposing system failures, that irreversible executions prevent from being corrected through official channels that prioritize efficiency over accuracy, and that refuse acknowledging errors even when overwhelming proof demonstrates that innocent people were executed, while actual murderers remained free. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of judicial murder and procedural rigidity across 125 years, the discovery that James Kilgore was hanged based on perjured testimony from witness who concealed financial interest creating motive for false identification, the Tennessee court's refusal to consider overwhelming evidence proving innocence because procedural rules preventing post-conviction review valued finality over truth, the systematic elimination of 20 deputies, including 6 who'd privately objected to participating but had been coerced through threats of termination, the official exoneration acknowledging judicial murder 116 years after execution, the federal legislation requiring courts to consider actual innocence claims named for James, the impossible questions about whether killing 20 people could ever be justified, when responding to execution of innocent brother, and whether victims whose degrees of culpability varied should have been distinguished rather than being targeted equally. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how procedural barriers, preventing consideration of exculpatory evidence, create judicial murders. How institutional rigidity valuing finality over truth results in executing innocent people. How systematic violence affects everyone, when legal systems refuse acknowledging errors that result in irreversible deaths. Comment about whether Lewis's campaign was proportional response to judicial murder, or whether alternatives existed. Whether 125 years and official exoneration provide adequate resolution when violence killed 20, including coerced participants. Whether memorial should emphasize James's innocence or acknowledge complexity, including deputies' varied culpability. Because these questions persist wherever procedural rules prevent courts from considering evidence proving innocence. Wherever institutional rigidity values efficiency over accuracy, wherever families must decide between accepting that systems won't acknowledge errors, resulting in deaths, and employing private violence that law condemns, but that judicial murders sometimes provoke when alternatives are systematically denied, and when authorities demonstrate unwillingness to admit mistakes, even when overwhelming proof demonstrates that innocence existed but was ignored through. Applying rules preventing truth from affecting outcomes that procedures produced regardless of whether those outcomes were just or represented catastrophic failures, killing people whose guilt was never proven, despite systems claiming that convictions established facts beyond reasonable doubt. The broader implications of Lewis Kilgore's case extended beyond individual tragedy, when modern researchers examining wrongful execution patterns discovered that James's judicial murder had been one among potentially hundreds of cases throughout American history where innocent people had been executed when procedural barriers had prevented courts from considering evidence proving innocence. That emerged after trials concluded that Lewis's systematic violence, while exceptional in its thoroughness and efficiency, represented understandable if not justifiable response to failures affecting countless families whose loved ones had been judicially murdered while systems had refused acknowledging errors because institutional commitments to finality had exceeded commitments to truth and accuracy that justice supposedly required as fundamental principles.